Hi, Kevin Coop here, and this is FaceTime with the Content Guy. Michael Sansolo's column this week I thought was a really good one because it looked at a problem that while he focused on the movie industry and what executives are doing in that industry right now, he was really focusing on a problem that afflicts a lot of different companies. Basically, the premise of the column was how movie studios, movie production companies are blaming the website Rotten Tomatoes, which makes a lot of different kinds of reviews from a wide range of reviewers easily accessible to consumers. And they're blaming Rotten Tomatoes for the fact that they had a really crappy summer at the box office. They're not blaming the fact that they had crappy movies in the theaters for the most part. And that's a real problem, right? It's the notion that you don't fix the problem, you fix blame. That's something that a lot of different businesses do, and it's exactly the wrong thing to do. You know, it's a lot more fun and a lot more interesting to talk about companies and people that do the right thing. I really loved Kate's column this week because she talked about the idea that boutique owners who were not in Florida and Texas basically were coming to the aid of boutique owners in areas that were afflicted by hurricanes. They recognize that one of the real problems they have is getting merchandise. So they're helping them out. They're sending them merchandise so they can stay in business. Lack of merchandise is one of the things that puts a lot of small businesses out of business, especially after a disaster like a hurricane. Again, really, really good news. There was a story this week in the Washington Post about how Tesla, now I thought this was fascinating, and not least for the technological part of it. Tesla decided to send out a software update for a lot of its electric cars this week that allowed owners to sort of tap this part of the battery they usually leave in reserve. They don't usually have access to. So they could have longer battery power when they're trying to evacuate from a place that's about to get hit by a storm. Again, a company doing exactly the right thing. It's not a permanent fix, but it was a temporary fix to get them through a hard time. A really good thing to do. Of course, there were a lot of stories in the last couple of weeks about retail companies in general, but especially retail companies, really doing their best during really tough times. Hurricanes hitting Texas, hurricanes hitting Florida, to make sure that people had the kinds of supplies, the kinds of services they needed to keep themselves afloat. And I really mean that pun because I mean it both in the physical sense as well as in the kind of spiritual sense. They did their best. And that's really what you have to do in these kinds of situations. It's great when you see people and companies doing what they can to help their fellow citizens. It makes you forget about a lot of the toxicity that's out there in terms of public discourse. But of course, there were companies that did exactly the wrong thing. Take, for example, the 7-Eleven franchisee in Florida, who was found to be gouging people for bottled water prices. Again, that's not the right thing to do. It's definitely the wrong thing to do. Or take the Pizza Hut manager down in Florida, who basically let his people know, hey, listen, I don't care what the authorities are saying in terms of when you're supposed to evacuate. You're not going to evacuate until this point, and you better be back by this point. Otherwise, we're going to dock your pay. There may be disciplinary action. This guy didn't care about his employees. He didn't care about his customers. He just cared about making a buck. And that's a terrible thing to do. It was a terrible message to send. And I think it's really good that the 7-Eleven franchisee and the Pizza Hut franchisee get roasted on social media. That's exactly what should happen in this case. This is where, by the way, Rotten Tomatoes comes in handy. You can let the world know when people aren't doing their job the right way. That's a really important thing to do. I always wonder, what are these people thinking? What are they thinking when they're having these moments when they're saying, I'm going to squeeze people just a little bit more. I'm going to make it harder for people a little bit more. What are they thinking? They're not thinking about their customers. They're not thinking about their employees. They're thinking about themselves. They're thinking about making a buck. And, sometimes you have to forget about that stuff. You have to think differently. By the way, having nothing to do with the storm, one of the policies that I've run up against in a number of companies lately, which I think is an abominable policy, is the notion of paid time off. And what that means is when companies decide what they're going to do is you have your vacation time and sick time, and it's all combined as one. And maybe it's 10 days, 11 days, 12 days, whatever it happens to be. And here's the deal. If you get the flu early in the year, you're going to get very little vacation time at the end of the year because it's all coming out of the same pool. Or if you get sick, or maybe you get the flu after you've had a vacation, well, you're going to have a choice. You can either go to work sick, or you can be docked for your pay. Neither one makes a lot of sense. You end up with either burned out employees, or you have employees who are coming to work sick, getting other people sick. It doesn't make sense. Again, these are just, I think to me, they call it PTO, I call it BS, because what they're totally doing is they're focusing on their own narrow agendas, and they're not thinking about their people or even their customer, or quite frankly, they don't even think about their brand equity. It's entirely stupid. There's a lot of that going around. Companies that do the wrong thing, that do the stupid thing. But the good news is there are good people out there, and they tend to compensate. And I think it's a really positive thing in the world when we start to pay attention to the good stuff and not the bad stuff. I love, it makes me think about the lines from A Man for All Seasons, Thomas More, when he's making the argument that he has to do the right thing. He has to behave in a moral and ethical way, even in the face of a petty, small-minded, self-indulgent king who believes the law does not apply to him. And what does he say? He says, if we lived in a state where virtue was profitable, common sense would make us good, and greed would make us saintly. And we'd live like animals or angels in the happy land that needs no heroes. But since, in fact, we see that avarice, anger, envy, pride, sloth, lust, and stupidity commonly profit far beyond humility, chastity, fortitude, justice, and thought, and have to choose to be human at all, why then perhaps we must stand fast a little, even at the risk of being heroes. Anyway, that's what's on my mind this morning, and as always, I want to hear what's on your mind.